Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Wadsworth at Kennesaw State University, School of Music, College of the Arts, and I'm going to be talking to you about scales today. Scales are something that pretty much every musician works on. I mean, I work on my scales all the time. But I'm not going to be talking to you today about how we practice scales. I'm going to be talking about how we analyze scales, so as to get a better understanding of a piece of music. So let's begin. So this talk is about scales in music, and there are some things you should know first. For instance, we have treble clef, which is oriented around G. So then the lines will be E, G, B, D, and F. Bass clef is oriented around F, so its lines are going to be G, B, D, F, and A. You probably know at least one of those two clefs. Middle C is the note in the middle of the piano. Okay, so it can be read in treble and in bass clef, so it kind of swings to either side. A half step is the smallest distance on the piano keyboard, so you can spell it, for instance, C to C sharp or C to D flat. A whole step, on the other hand, is going to be slightly bigger. It's going to consist of two half steps. For instance, C to D has two half steps, C to C sharp and C sharp to D. Next, how do we analyze scales in a piece of music? Well, in general, you're going to have to reorder the notes from low to high. Let's take a piece such as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So for many scales, you're going to start them on the tonic note, which is generally your beginning and ending note. You're going to eliminate any notes not in the scale. And here we just have notes of the scale. You want to get the step intervals of the scale. So we have those 6 notes in Twinkle Twinkle, and you have to suggest or infer a missing note of a B to make the scale work. Okay. So what are the step intervals that we have? Whole step, because there's one note in between. Whole step, half, whole, another whole step, another whole step, and then a half step right up at the top of the scale. Okay. So let's do another example of scale analysis. By the way, the scale I just did for Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, that was C major, okay, because of the interval pattern. Here's an example of scale analysis from the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók. This is the beginning of diminished fifth. Imagine you want to know what the scale is. So in this case, you would have to rewrite the scale from low to high. So in this particular case, it doesn't matter because the scale alternates between two intervals, which note I started on. I'm going to start it on A. So if we try that, we start with a whole step, half, whole, and then to another half, then whole, then half, then whole. And this turns out to be the scale called octatonic. And I've chosen to begin it on a whole step and then a half step, but you don't have to do that. Okay, so knowing that scale, I think, then changes the way we're going to play that piece. Let's talk about major and minor scales in greater detail. Okay, so major is going to have your two half steps, then, two whole steps, then a half step, then 3 whole steps, and then a half step. And it doesn't matter what notes you start on, it's going to have that pattern all the time. Minor is a little bit more changeable. Minor, you're going to start off whole half, whole on the bottom, regardless, okay? Natural minor is going to have at the top 4 notes, half, whole, and then whole. Harmonic minor, which is named harmonic because we use it for a lot of the harmonies that we play in minor, is going to have a half step, an augmented second, which is like a really big step, and then a half step on top. Melodic minor, which is named that way because that's often how we write melodies and sing them, is like major on the way up, whole step, half. And on the way down, it tends to be, we start off with a whole step going down, whole step down, and then half step down. Seen another way, going down on melodic minor, if we reverse the direction, it would be half, whole, and then whole. So those are your major and minor scales. The ones that people practice the most are major and harmonic minor. Okay, but let's not simply stick with major and minor scales. Let's also talk about diatonic modes. What happens if we begin a major scale on a different note of the scale, so that, let's say, scale degree 2 becomes the new 1. So let's say I'm playing C major, and I begin it actually on scale degree 2, and I'm going to call that the new 1. Well, that would become a Dorian mode. That would have its own whole and half steps. Okay. Now, the diatonic modes were used in medieval and Renaissance music, although they were slightly different. They had a different idea of what a mode was. For what we're going to do, we're going to use a memorization strategy called a mnemonic, and it's going to be Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. And if you take the first letters of each of those and come up with a silly saying, I have the sentence, I don't particularly like my aunt's lasagna. And there are other ones that I've heard, but I like this one. So if you remember that series, the IDPLMAL, you'll then be able to generate all of your modes. Okay, so Ionian starts on 1, Dorian starts on 2, Phrygian starts on 3, Lydian on 4, Mixolydian on 5, Aeolian on 6, which is, by the way, the same thing as natural minor, and Locrian starts on 7. Now, we can do this with any scale. So if I take G major, there's G major Ionian, okay? And then this would be Dorian, creating using a G major scale. This would be Phrygian. And so we can generate these 7 different modes based on any major scale that you want to choose, okay? But how does this work in analysis? So I've got some examples here of mode analysis. So like we talked about before, the main thing is to get the step intervals of your mode, okay? Find out where the whole half pattern, in this case, would end. Because right above that half step, up on top, you have your 3 whole steps and then a half step. Right above that half step will be your scale degree 1 of the major scale. Now, you could use key signatures to get the mode and figure out what degree of the major scale you started on. But what I would recommend is that you go to the 3 whole steps in a row, and then to the half step, and then right above it is going to be what's called the final or the tonic of the mode. And there are other scales that we can have. So the main thing is to always write the scale out from low to high, always get those step intervals. Are they whole steps? Are they half steps? Are they minor thirds? What are they? Okay. So this very first scale is actually not going to be a mode. It's a symmetrical scale. You may know it. Okay, Okay, so let's put this into scalar order. Okay, and if you look at all the intervals, they are all whole tones, because on the keyboard, between one of them is a single note. So with this, the scale, it must be a whole tone scale, okay? And there are only two possible whole tone scales. One starts on C, one starts on C sharp or D flat. This one contained the note C sharp, so we would call it C sharp whole tone. So a little bit different from a mode. Letter B, on the other hand, is a mode because it has mostly whole steps, but just a little sprinkling of half steps. Now, when you listen to this mode, you may be tempted to hear different notes as the tonic. So I'm going to assume that the beginning and ending notes are tonic, okay? On the other hand, some people could hear this particular mode differently. That's why we can have a recurring conversation on these things. So in letter B here, what we want to do here, if we assume that the first note of the scale is C, we're then going to play it from low to high and get all the intervals. So what do we have? We have a half step, whole, 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 half, whole, and whole. So what we want to do is find the three whole steps, the half step above that, and then the next note is going to be our scale degree 1. And then from there, we're going to extrapolate and count and find what scale degree we started on. So let's see here. So we have three whole steps. Okay, so there is our scale degree 1. So we started on 1, 2, 3. So then I go back to our mnemonic, ID, P, L, M, A, L. And so it's not Ionian, it's not Dorian, it's Phrygian. Okay? So letter B here, the second scale I played is, it would be analyzed in C Phrygian. Okay, we would not say A flat Phrygian, we'd say C Phrygian. It's the new scale degree 1. Okay. All right, here's a cool example of a mode. The French composer Gabriel Fauré spent a lot of his life basing his music, which was early Impressionist to sort of mid-Impressionist in France, on different modes. And here's an example of the Lydian mode, which would be a major scale where you start on scale degree 4. So this is from the song Lydia by Fauré. So it sounds like F major. And there's the very hopeful sounding Lydian mode with sharp 4. So Fauré, he plays around with whole bunches of ideas. Since he's in F major and then he alters the B flat to B natural, he then takes advantage of that to go to other keys like A minor. So that's a pretty cool example. And that particular song is something that a lot of our vocal majors for sopranos will be singing at some point. Okay, let's move on to other symmetrical scales, which are called synthetic scales. So synthetic means anything that's not major, minor, or classical. So we already talked about whole tone scales. On the slides, I have a brief description of whole tone. We have octatonic, which we've discussed as well. So octatonic scales alternate between whole and half steps. Octatonic scales have some interesting properties. If you go back to Diminished Fifth by Bartók, you will notice that every other note of the octatonic scale is what's called a minor third apart. And a minor third is 3 half steps. So, and then the other bunch of minor thirds would be this. Okay, and then each of those chords is called a fully diminished 7th chord, which is why some people call the octatonic scale a diminished scale. Okay, there's one more synthetic scale you should know about. That's called hexatonic. Hexatonic simply means a scale with 6 notes. A hexatonic scale is going to alternate between minor thirds and half steps. Okay, so a hexatonic scale is interesting. It's symmetrical and synthetic, just like octatonic. But in this case, what you're going to have is you're going to have 2 interlocking augmented triads. Okay, so actually let me play that one again. So if we start off minor third, half step, minor third, half step, minor third. Okay, now I'm in the correct hand position. Sorry about that. So you could have this alternating with that. Okay, you can see how valuable it is to have the theory behind the scale, because I was about to make a mistake with how I played it, and then I corrected myself. And there are only 4 distinct hexatonic collections. They're labeled C, C sharp, C sharp D, D, D sharp, and D sharp B. Okay, I just have a couple more scales. Other scales which are used far more in Asian music are pentatonic. So pentatonic are asymmetrical like the major scale. They tend to not be used widely in classical music, except they are in folk music. We have major pentatonic, which is basically the first, second, third, fifth, and 6th notes of major. And you can transpose that to start on anything. We also have minor pentatonic scales. Those have scale degrees 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8 of natural minor. And you can again transpose those to start on any note. So. Okay. Finally, the last scale I wanted to tell you about is a chromatic scale. The chromatic scale is our only scale with all half steps. Okay. Usually we're going to spell those notes that are accidentals. We're going to raise them or use sharps on the way up, or double sharps or whatever. Very often we're going to use flats, or we're going to lower notes on the way down. Okay. I've illustrated here on the slides a sample C chromatic scale. Not all composers notate chromatic scales the same way. Some will mix and match some of the sharps and flats from the 2 sides when you go up or down. But chromatic scales are important to know. All right, let's think about some emotional connotations of scales. Major tends to be happy or good. Minor tends to be sad or evil. Okay. Lydian, if we have, just like what you heard in the Foray song, that's been used in movies countless times to show optimism, a belief in the power of the future. Dorian mode has often been used to show sort of a sad expression, but also somewhat hopeful. Okay. Phrygian mode is very often tragic. So in minor mode, sometimes people use the chord progression tonic. It's called the Neapolitan or flat 2, 5 and then 1. And then the flat 2 chord is derived from Phrygian mode. The octatonic was used by Russian composers such as Rimsky-Korsakov and later by film composers such as John Williams to show magic. So Stravinsky uses 2 major chords, a tritone apart. which is part of an octatonic scale in Petrushka. So like ideas of magic permeate everything there. And then hexatonic very often is used to express the past. So if we go from a major chord to another major chord down by major third. Okay, so hexatonic, pretty cool. Another cool example of a scale is from the introduction to Winterreise, the great song cycle by Franz Schubert. This one is in D minor, and you're going to hear a D harmonic minor scale. So as you can hear, that introduction to the whole song cycle is highly mournful, lamenting. The wanderer has been cast away by his lover, and he is simply going to wander, and we don't know what happens to him. So minor mode works very nicely for that. Okay, at this point, what are our takeaways on scales? Well, how do we recognize a mode or what you could call a collection, which could be a synthetic scale? So draw the scale on the staff from low to high and get the step intervals in between notes. Don't assume you know the scale just from glancing at it. Get the number of notes per scale. Pentatonic has 5 notes, whereas the diatonic mode will have 7. Octatonic will have 8, and whole tone and hexatonic will both have 6. If you have a diatonic mode and a pentatonic scale, and these are asymmetrical, or if you have a synthetic scale, think about, do we have just a sprinkling of half steps, but mostly whole steps, or are we alternating strictly between 2 intervals? Because if you're alternating between 2 intervals, there is no tonic, okay? But if it's a diatonic mode, like Ionian or major, you're only going to have your 2 half steps, but mostly whole steps, okay? If you do have a diatonic mode or a pentatonic scale, find the tonic based on the starting note of a passage or the ending note, okay? If you have a synthetic scale, try to identify which transposition it is. Look for a half step if you can, or a note as far down to C as you can manage. So let's say for octatonic, it could be C, C sharp, C sharp, D, or D, D sharp. And you don't identify tonic notes of synthetic scales. And obviously, there can be ambiguous cases if a scale is incomplete or contains non-scale or chromatic notes. Imagine a piece in C major, which involves chromatic passing tones. So there can be a lot of interpretation that's needed. So I hope that this introduction to scales is interesting for you and adds new dimensions to the scales you've already been practicing. So on the very last slide, I have my contact information. I'd love to hear any feedback on this video. I also provided my cell phone number, and please text me first so I know it's you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon in classes.